Welcome back, everybody. Please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the show if you're enjoying it. We appreciate it. So let's talk about what happened in Washington, D.C. this week. We're looking at congressional records from February 3rd to the 7th. This is your quick guide to what went down in the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Lots to cover, so let's get to it.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's start with the Senate. The week began with Christopher Wright's confirmation as Secretary of Energy. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, right?
Oh, yeah, it's a big appointment for sure. The vote was interesting. It was 59 yays to 38 nays. Kind of shows you how divided things are becoming along party lines. It'll be interesting to see how Wright navigates that as he starts making policy changes.
Yeah, that's true. And speaking of appointments, the Senate got a ton of nominations this week. I won't go through all of them, but a few that stood out were Tristan Abbey for Administrator of the Energy Information Administration. And then there was Devin Westhill nominated as Assistant Secretary of Agriculture.
Yeah, it's amazing. All these different nominations really give you a sense of the scope of the federal government. It's massive, so many moving parts, and every one of these positions has an important role to play.
It really does. It's kind of like taking a peek behind the curtain to see how things work, but nominations are just the first step.
Right. The Senate spent a lot of time this week considering some key appointments. One that comes to mind is Russell Vought for Director of the Office of Management and Budget.
Oh, yeah. That one definitely caused some sparks. The vote on cloture was tight, 51 yays to 46 nays.
Cloture.
Yeah, cloture. It basically means ending the debate so they can actually vote. It requires a supermajority so it can get past a filibuster.
Right.
So in this case, the close vote on cloture tells you Voss' nomination was a tough one. Strong opinions on both sides, for sure.
Makes sense. I mean, the OMB director has a huge influence on the federal budget. I can see why it would be controversial.
For sure.
And Vought wasn't the only one who got some attention. Pamela Bondi's nomination for Attorney General also went down to the wire. Yeah, another nail-biter. 52 yays to 46 nays on the cloture vote there. The Senate is definitely divided on that one.
Yeah, I can see why. The Attorney General is the head of the Justice Department.
Yeah.
And they're the top law enforcement officer in the country. A lot of power there. Makes sense that it would be a tough nomination.
Definitely.
But it wasn't all close calls. Douglas Collins was confirmed as Secretary of Veterans Affairs by a much larger margin, 77 yays to 23 nays.
Yeah, it seems like when it comes to taking care of veterans and making sure they get the benefits they deserve, there's much more agreement.
Good to see some common ground.
Mm-hmm.
Another confirmation that caught my eye was Eric Turner for Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. This one also involved cloture, 55 yays to 45 nays.
Housing and urban development are always at the center of these big policy debates. So, yeah, it's understandable that Turner's confirmation got people talking. I mean, you think about it. Affordable housing, community development, urban renewal, they all have a huge impact on people's lives. Different approaches obviously lead to some strong feelings.
It makes sense. So, all in all, a pretty busy week for the Senate. Looks like there are a lot of new faces coming in, and some of them will be in some very powerful positions.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these new folks approach their jobs and what kind of impact they have on policy in the coming months and years.
For sure. All right, now let's move over to the House of Representatives. Unlike the Senate, they weren't in session on February 3rd, so they got started on the 4th.
Yeah, and they jumped right in, passing a bunch of bills on all kinds of topics.
One that I thought was pretty remarkable was H.R. 835, the 9/11 Memorial and Museum Act. It provided a grant to the National September 11 Memorial and Museum.
That act's really important for a couple of reasons. First, it makes sure that a site that's so meaningful to so many Americans will be taken care of, operational costs, all that. Second, it really shows a commitment to remembering the people we lost on 9/11.
Yeah, absolutely. Then there were two bills about Alaska Native claims, H.R. 42 and H.R. 43.
Yeah, so H.R. 42 was dealing with a specific issue about eligibility for settlement trusts. They wanted to make sure that certain payments that Alaska Natives received or their descendants wouldn't keep them from getting benefits from other programs, things like social services and education.
I see.
And then H.R. 43 was about land ownership. They wanted to clarify how land is transferred to the state of Alaska, making sure things are done fairly. Actually, that bill, H.R. 43, passed with a huge majority. 412 yays to only 1 nay.
Wow.
Yeah, you don't see that very often. Shows you there's strong bipartisan support when it comes to resolving land ownership in Alaska.
Yeah, you're right about that. Another one that I thought was interesting was H.R. 226, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Historic Lands Reacquisition Act.
Yeah, so that act's all about giving back certain federal lands in Tennessee to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. What's really interesting about this one is that it's part of a bigger trend, addressing historical injustices and recognizing that Native American tribes have sovereignty. These land reacquisition acts are a big deal. They often take years of negotiation, and they're part of this ongoing effort to, make things right and heal old
Yeah,
wounds.
makes sense. And then there's HR 776, the Nutria Eradication and Control Reauthorization Act of 2025. It might sound a bit niche, but it's actually pretty important for the environment.
Oh, absolutely. You know those nutria, those big semi-aquatic rodents? Well, they're invasive and they can really mess up wetlands and other ecosystems. So this act makes sure there's funding for programs that are trying to control their population and, get rid of them where they're not supposed to be. It's a sign that people are really starting to pay attention to environmental issues and they're willing to do something about it. The vote was 361 yeas to 56 nays, which means it had support from both sides of the aisle.
That's good to see. It's fascinating how even something that seems small, like these rodents, can have such a big impact on the environment, right?
Oh, definitely. It shows how everything's connected, and we need to be really careful about how we manage our natural resources.
It really does. Now, it wasn't all just bills and votes this week. The House also took a moment of silence to remember the victims of that midair collision in Washington, D.C. on January 29th.
Yeah, that was a really somber moment. A good reminder that even in the middle of all the busy legislative work, tragedy can still strike.
For sure. Okay, shifting gears a bit. Fentanyl-related legislation was a big focus for the House this week.
Yeah, H.R. 27, the Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act, caused a lot of debate. There was this amendment proposed, the Trahan Amendment, which wanted to wait to put the bill into action until they knew for sure it would help with overdose deaths.
I see.
But in the end, that amendment was rejected. The final vote on the bill was 312 yeas to 108 nays, which shows how seriously they're taking this issue.
It really does. This whole opioid crisis is just heartbreaking. It's affecting so many people all over the country.
Yeah, it really is. And the debates around H.R. 27 show how hard it is to figure out drug policy. They want to stop fentanyl from being sold illegally, but they also don't want to create unintended consequences. It's a tricky balance, and it has to include both prevention and treatment.
I understand. And finally, another big development was the formation of the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, this new committee is made up of both Republicans and Democrats, and they're going to be looking at all the different challenges and opportunities that come with China's growing influence in the world. It shows that both parties are focused on the relationship between the U.S. and China, and they recognize how important it is in the 21st century.
Makes sense. So the House had a busy week, too. They dealt with everything from land ownership to environmental protection to the opioid crisis and international relations.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of. But remember, what happens in Congress affects everyone. Staying informed about what they're doing can help you understand how those decisions might impact you and your community.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's talk about the congressional committees. They're like the unsung heroes of the legislative process, you know?
BPDs do so much of the behind-the-scenes work. They do research, they get testimony from experts, and they really fine-tune legislation before it even gets a vote.
They're like the workshops where everything gets hammered out.
That's a good way to put it.
So what were some of the interesting committee meetings this week?
Well, the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry had a hearing on the agricultural economy.
So it wasn't just about, how much crops cost.
No, they were probably talking about a whole bunch of things that affect farmers and ranchers. Trade policy, climate change, the future of technology and farming, it's all connected.
That's a lot to cover.
Oh, for sure. But these hearings are important because they give experts and stakeholders and even regular people a chance to share their concerns and their ideas. And that all helps to inform the decisions that get made.
That's great. The House Committee on Energy and Commerce also had a hearing that caught my attention. It was called Powering America's Future, Unleashing American Energy.
Yeah, that one sounds pretty interesting, right? They were probably looking at all the different sources of energy in the U.S., everything from those traditional fossil fuels to the new stuff like solar and wind power. It's a big issue because the choices we make about energy have a huge impact on the environment, the economy, and whether we can rely on our own energy sources.
It's true. Energy policy is a balancing act. You've got to weigh the needs of the economy against protecting the environment. It's not easy.
No, it's definitely not. And these hearings are where they try to sort through it all. They look at different points of view and try to come up with solutions.
Makes sense. And one more committee meeting I wanted to mention is the one held by the Senate Judiciary Committee. It was called Poisoning of America, and it was all about the fentanyl crisis.
Yeah, that's a critical issue. They were probably looking at all sorts of legislative responses to the opioid epidemic. Things like making those fentanyl analogs permanently scheduled drugs, just like in HR 27.
This crisis has affected so many people, so it's good that Congress is really focusing on it.
I agree. These hearings are really important for raising awareness, giving people who've been impacted by the crisis a chance to speak, and getting things moving.
Absolutely. So what else were the committees doing this week?
A lot of them were busy getting organized for the new session of Congress. Adopting rules, assigning members to subcommittees, that kind of thing.
Why is that so important?
Well, it might not seem very exciting, but those procedures really matter. They make sure that Congress runs smoothly. Clear rules and structures are super important for making sure things are fair and transparent, and that people are held accountable.
So even the stuff that doesn't make headlines is still important.
Exactly. It's all part of the bigger picture.
I like that. Were there any other interesting committee developments?
Well, the House created a brand new committee called the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party.
Why did they decide to create that one?
Well, there's growing concern on both sides of the aisle about China's role in the world. They're becoming more and more influential, and both Republicans and Democrats are starting to pay attention. They wanted a dedicated committee to really dig into the challenges and opportunities that come with this relationship.
Makes sense. The world is changing, and Congress needs to adapt too.
Exactly. This committee will probably be really important for shaping how the U.S. interacts with China in the years to come.
It's amazing to see all the work that these committees do. They're like the engine that keeps Congress running.
I know, right? Most people don't even realize they exist, but they're absolutely vital to the whole legislative process. They shape the laws that affect all of us.
It's true. And that's what makes it so important to understand what they're doing. We covered a lot of ground in this part, didn't we? We talked about major events, bills, resolutions, and all the work that happens in the committees.
We did. And in part 2, we're going to delve even deeper into the specifics. We'll be looking at the bills and resolutions that were introduced and debated this week in February.
We'll break down the language, look at the arguments for and against each measure, and give you all the context you need to understand these issues. So stay tuned for part 2.
Welcome back, everyone. Now let's take a closer look at some of the bills and resolutions that were introduced in Congress this week. Sometimes the details are where things get really interesting.
Yeah, you always hear the devil's in the details, right? So what kind of stuff can we learn by really digging into those details?
Well, we can get a better sense of what's important to the people we elected, what they're thinking about, what they're worried about, and we can start to imagine how these new laws might actually play out in the real world.
That makes sense. Okay, so where should we begin? Let's go back to HR 27, the Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act. That one had a lot of people talking in the House.
Yeah, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Stop fentanyl trafficking. What was so controversial about it?
Well, the bill wants to make fentanyl-related substances Schedule I drugs permanently.
Yeah.
And that's been a tricky issue for a while.
So what does Schedule I even mean?
It's like the strictest category for drugs, the ones they consider really dangerous and with no medical use. The people who support HR 27, they say that putting fentanyl-related substances in this category will give law enforcement more power to stop them from being sold illegally.
Yeah, I can see their point. But what about the people who don't support the bill?
Right, so the people who are against it, they're worried that making it permanent could stop research into fentanyl analogs. Maybe they could be useful for something medical, even though they're dangerous right now. And some people say we don't need to make it permanent because the temporary schedule already gives law enforcement a lot of power.
It sounds like they're trying to find a balance, right? Make sure law enforcement has the tools it needs, but also leave some room for research, just in case.
Yeah, exactly. It's this constant tension in drug policy. You have to think about public safety, but also individual rights, and the fact that we might be able to use some of these drugs for medical purposes in the future.
Right. And the Trahan Amendment wanted to wait and see what the impact would be on overdose deaths before putting the bill into action.
Yeah, that's all about unintended consequences, right? Some experts are worried that if you just crack down on law enforcement, it could actually push the fentanyl market further underground. And if that happens, it might actually lead to more overdoses, not fewer.
It's a tough situation. No easy answers.
It really is. It just goes to show you that even when a law is created with good intentions, there can be consequences you don't expect.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's talk about H.R. 835 now. The 9/11 Memorial and Museum Act. Seems like everyone would support that, right?
It definitely seems like a good thing, remembering what happened. But if you look at the specifics, it's a little more interesting. The bill didn't just give them money. It was a one-time grant to cover the costs of operating the memorial and museum, keeping it safe, and maintaining it.
So it's not just about remembering the past, it's also about making sure people can visit the memorial for years to come.
Exactly. It shows that Congress is committed to keeping the memory of 9/11 alive. And it also shows how important it is to keep supporting these memorials financially.
You're right. Makes you think about all the other memorials out there and all the work and money it takes to take care of them.
Yeah, it's a big job. Speaking of which, let's go back to those bills about Alaska Native claims, H.R. 42 and H.R. 43.
Yeah, tell me more about those.
They both deal with some pretty complex issues about land in Alaska. Who owns it and what rights people have. H.R. 42 was all about making sure that certain payments made to Alaska Natives or their descendants wouldn't prevent them from getting other benefits, things like social services or help with education.
It sounds like they were trying to prevent some inequalities that could come up.
Exactly. And H.R. 43 dealt with a problem that's been around since the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. It clarified that village corporations didn't have to give land to the state of Alaska to create municipal corporations. So it basically strengthens the land rights of those Alaska Native communities.
I see. So both bills are about making sure that Alaska Native communities are treated fairly and that their rights are protected.
Yeah, and it's all part of this bigger effort to address the legacy of colonialism. It's about recognizing that Native American tribes have sovereignty and they have the right to decide what happens in their own communities.
That's really important. Okay, let's move on to something a little lighter. I'm talking about H.R. 776, the Nutria Eradication and Control Reauthorization Act of 2025. Sounds kind of funny, but I'm sure it's a serious issue.
Oh, yeah, it definitely is. You see, nutria, those big semi-aquatic rodents, they might look cute, but they're a real problem. They're invasive, which means they don't belong here, and they can cause a lot of damage to wetlands, coastlines, and farms.
So it's not just about protecting wildlife. It's about protecting whole ecosystems and the people who rely on them for their livelihood.
That's right. So this bill makes sure that there's funding to control the nutria population and get rid of them in the places where they're causing harm. It shows that people are starting to understand the threat of invasive species, and they're willing to take action.
It's a good reminder that even something small, like a rodent, can have a big impact on the environment.
Absolutely. It's all connected. What happens to one part of the ecosystem affects everything else.
Okay, let's shift gears again. H.R. 226, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Historic Lands Reacquisition Act, caught my eye.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting one. This act tells the Secretary of the Interior to take back certain federal lands in Tennessee and hold them in trust for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. They're basically giving the land back to its original owners.
I'm noticing a theme here. Recognizing past injustices and actually doing something to correct them.
You got it. This is part of this larger effort to right some of the wrongs that were done to Native American tribes. These land reacquisition acts are usually the result of years of negotiation, and they're a step towards making things right and healing those old wounds.
It's a long process, but it seems like it's moving in the right direction.
It definitely is. It's about respecting the sovereignty of Native American tribes and working together to create a future that's more just and equitable for everyone.
Okay, now for a resolution that stood out to me. SRES 55, which made January 2025 National Mentoring Month. It seems like a really positive thing. Well, what's the bigger message here?
It might seem like a small gesture, but it actually highlights how important mentoring is. Mentors can really make a difference in the lives of young people, and they help to build stronger communities.
So it's more than just a pat on the back for mentors.
Yeah, for sure. The resolution talks about all the benefits of having a mentor, like doing better in school, growing as a person, and finding a good career. It encourages people and organizations to get involved in mentoring programs. It's about recognizing the positive impact that mentors have on everyone involved.
That's awesome. We need to invest in future generations. And mentoring is a great way to do that.
Exactly. Mentorship empowers people, it helps them develop leadership skills, and it connects people from different generations.
You know, I'm really starting to see how those little details in these bills and resolutions tell a bigger story.
It's like putting a puzzle together, right? Each piece might not seem that important on its own, but when you put them all together, you get a better picture of the whole thing.
That's what we're all about here, helping people see the bigger picture.
And speaking of seeing the bigger picture, in part 3, we're going to dive into the world of congressional committees. We'll explore how the work they do shapes everything that happens in Congress.
Welcome back, everyone. We've seen bills being passed, nominations debated, resolutions adopted. Now let's take a closer look at the congressional committees, those groups working hard behind the scenes.
You can think of them as specialized teams, each focusing on a particular area, like agriculture or energy. They're crucial in shaping legislation and keeping an eye on government activities.
So they're like the subject matter expert.
Exactly. And this structure allows Congress to efficiently and effectively tackle a wide range of issues.
Which committees were particularly busy this week?
Well, the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry stands out. They had a hearing on the agricultural economy.
So it wasn't just about the price of crops.
Oh no. This hearing probably covered a whole spectrum of issues affecting farmers and ranchers, things like trade policies, the impact of climate change, and even the future of farming technology.
Sounds like a lot to cover.
It is. But these hearings give experts, stakeholders, and everyday people a chance to share their concerns and ideas. That all helps to inform those policy decisions.
I see. The House Committee on Energy and Commerce also had a hearing that caught my eye. It was called Powering America's Future, Unleashing American Energy.
That one sounds interesting. They were likely examining various energy sources, from traditional fossil fuels to renewable sources like solar and wind power. These are big choices we make because they impact our energy independence, economic competitiveness, and environmental sustainability.
It's a good reminder that energy policy has to balance the needs of the economy with environmental concerns.
Exactly. And these hearings provide an opportunity for everyone to come to the table and explore different perspectives and potential solutions in a really complex policy area.
Now, the Senate Judiciary Committee also tackled a really serious issue with their Poisoning of America hearing. They were focused on the fentanyl crisis.
Yeah, in that hearing, they were probably exploring legislative responses to the ongoing opioid epidemic, including that potential for permanent scheduling of fentanyl analogs, as was proposed in H.R. 27.
The impact of this crisis is devastating. It's good to see Congress taking it so seriously.
It is. And these hearings are so important. They raise awareness, give those affected by the crisis a voice, and really promote action.
For sure. So what else were the committees working on this week?
Well, many were focused on organizational tasks, like adopting rules for the new congressional session and assigning members to subcommittees.
What's the importance of that kind of work?
While those tasks might seem a little routine, these procedures are actually essential for ensuring everything in Congress runs smoothly. Clear rules and structures are important for fairness, transparency, and accountability in the legislative process.
So even the less glamorous parts of the job are important.
Oh, absolutely. It all works together.
Okay, were there any other notable developments on the committee front?
Yes. The House formed a new select committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party.
What led to the creation of this committee?
This really highlights the growing concern in both parties about China's expanding global influence. They need a dedicated body to look at the challenges and opportunities presented by this evolving relationship.
It's important for Congress to adapt to the changing dynamics of international relations.
Absolutely. And this committee will likely play a key role in shaping U.S. policy toward China.
It's been so fascinating to learn about all the work that goes on in these committees, often without much public attention.
I know, right? They may not always be in the spotlight, but committees are really the backbone of Congress. They do the groundwork and lay the foundation for the laws that impact all our lives.
Well, that wraps up another deep dive into the congressional record. We covered a wide range of topics, from big events to the finer details of bills, resolutions, and committee activities. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Always a pleasure to break it all down.
Don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the show. And stay curious about what's happening in the world around you. We'll see you next time for another insightful exploration of current events.